Hey there. Tonight, we are beginning with a strange old feeling. The feeling that the sky itself may have once belonged to someone who never stopped looking down. In the oldest Sumerian records, in clay tablets lifted from Nippur and Eridu, there is a recurring image of Enlil, not as a distant god sleeping somewhere beyond the stars, but as a ruler stationed over the middle realm. The wind, the air, the storms, the breath between heaven and earth. And once you notice that, other details begin to gather around it. A temple that reads less like a shrine and more like a command post. Priests listening to winds as though they were reports. A world where bad kings are removed not because fortune changes, but because someone above has been observing them all along. If this kind of old mystery is your sort of quiet night, do take a moment to like the video and subscribe as well. It helps keep these long, dark stories alive. Now let the room grow softer. Let the day slip back a little, and come with me into the oldest part of the record, where history begins under a gaze. Before history began, someone was watching. That is the feeling these old tablets create, and I do not think that is an accident. The clay texts from Nippur and Eridu do not introduce Enlil in the tone of a far and abstract divinity. They place him in position. They give him jurisdiction. They assign him the sort of territory that feels less ceremonial than operational. Anu remains above, in the celestial distance. Enki keeps the deep waters and the hidden cleverness beneath the earth. But Enlil is placed in the middle realm, the surface of the earth, the moving air, the weather, the zone where human beings actually live and move and build and fail. That middle realm matters more than it first seems to. Air is not empty. Air is the thing that touches everything without being held. Wind enters fields, courtyards, temple stairways, sleeping chambers, river crossings, city gates. If a divine ruler were to choose one kingdom from which to observe the daily life of humanity, the atmosphere would be a frighteningly elegant choice. Nothing escapes it. A king can hide behind a wall. A farmer can work alone at the far edge of a field. A caravan can move between cities under dust and heat. The air still passes over all of them. The old titles sharpen that impression. In the tablets, Enlil is called Lord of the Gods. Yes, but also Lord of the Air, Lord of the Wind. Those are not decorative phrases when repeated often enough. They begin to sound like job descriptions. I have always found that strangely unsettling. The more ancient the text, the more ceremonial you expect it to be. Yet here, the language keeps edging toward administration. Territory, function, authority, oversight. The cosmic world in these records is divided as if it were a state, and Enlil receives the part most dangerously close to us. Imagine Nippur for a moment. Not the broken archaeological site, but the living city. Reed boats at the water. Mud brick walls holding the warmth of the day. Smoke lifting in thin, pale strands from ovens and kiln fires. Priests moving through temple courts before dawn. The Eker rising above the city, its sacred mass visible from every direction, not merely as a holy place but as a center. The kind of center around which all other movement quietly arranges itself. The records from Nippur make that center feel active. Enlil does not merely receive worship there. He rules through it. The Ekur, his great temple complex, reads at times like a headquarters. Inventories mention chambers with names that later readers have rendered as seeing stones and wind listeners. The exact nature of such things remains uncertain, and some scholars would urge caution there, quite rightly. Yet even caution cannot remove the mood of the texts. Priests are not simply praying upward into silence. They are maintaining channels. They are listening. They are treating atmospheric changes as meaningful transmissions. If you were standing on the upper level of such a place at night, the sensation would be difficult to forget. The air cooler than below. The city dim and scattered with isolated lamps. The smell of clay, oil, ash, and river dampness mixed with the faint dryness of old brick. Above, the stars. Around you, openings aligned with horizon and direction. Below, sleeping households, restless animals, guards half awake by gates, scribes with tablets stacked in shadowed rooms, rulers dreaming, perhaps, of power they believe is their own. And over all of it, the moving air. A priest standing there long enough might begin to feel that the wind was not simply passing by, but carrying news. The tablets suggest exactly that sort of mindset. Weather was not treated as mere weather. Unusual storms, droughts, winds, and atmospheric disturbances were read as signs of judgment, approval, warning, displeasure, or command. This makes sense in a religious culture, of course. But the thing that gives the idea its darker edge is how systematic the record-keeping seems to have been. The signs are catalogued, correlated, interpreted against political and social conditions. A bad season is not random. A storm is not empty. The sky is responding because the sky is aware. And once that idea is accepted, kingship itself changes shape. In Mesopotamian thought, the king is never entirely self-made. Authority comes from above. That line is familiar enough in ancient history. But in the Sumerian material surrounding Enlil, it takes on a distinctly supervisory quality. Kings are granted rule, observed while ruling, and removed when found wanting. The king list, royal formulas, temple tradition, all work together to create the impression that rulership is under review. Not once at coronation only. Continuously. There is something almost modern in that, though I say that cautiously. A ruler behaves as though public power belongs to him. Somewhere else, an unseen authority evaluates the performance. The difference, of course, is that modern systems usually pretend the observers are human. In these old texts, the watcher sits in the wind. This is where the title question quietly answers itself for the first time. What if Enlil never left Earth? The oldest sources do not speak as if he came briefly and vanished. They speak as if he was stationed here, as if Earth, especially the human world under the sky, was his assigned burden and domain. He was not visiting the atmosphere. He belonged to it. Honestly, that is one reason the whole thing lingers in the mind. Distant gods are easy to mythologize. they can remain symbols. But a god of the middle realm, a god of air and oversight, a god whose authority depends on constant awareness of human activity, feels more invasive, less like a story told by a fire, more like a condition of existence. The surviving clay only deepens that mood. These are not late mystical fantasies written after centuries of embellishment. They emerge from some of the oldest organized records humanity produced. The men who pressed those wedges into wet tablets were not writing in the language of modern skepticism, obviously, but neither were they careless dreamers. They were administrators of memory. They counted grain, measured labor, stored names, logged offerings, preserved legal forms, and in the same cultural breath preserved this idea that terrestrial life unfolded under a layered system of divine observation. That mixture matters. It is one thing for a poem to say the gods are watching. It is another for a civilization that worships through accounting, law, an archive to preserve the same claim in its deepest foundations. That is when mythology stops feeling decorative and starts feeling structural. Let us go a little closer still. The division of cosmic authority between Anu, Enki, and Enlil is not a loose family arrangement. It is orderly. Anu keeps the high celestial realm, too distant for daily human contact. Enki governs the hidden waters, fertility, craft, secrete intelligence, and the deep life beneath things. Enlil receives the surface world and the atmosphere, the place where human society unfolds in public view. That division places him in a uniquely strategic position. He can observe settlements, agriculture, movement, conflict, ritual, and growth through the behavior of weather itself. He becomes, in effect, the sovereign of everything exposed. And human life is mostly exposure. Fields open to the sky. Roads open to the sky. Roofs open to the sky. City walls, markets, shrines, canals, military roads, pasture edges, funeral processions, grain threshing floors, all of it under air. The realm of Enlil is not remote. It is the surface of ordinary life. That is perhaps the darkest thing about him. He does not need to descend very far to know us. Some of the oldest records from Eridu make this division feel almost procedural. Enlil is appointed by divine council decision. His role is assigned, justified, situated. Again, the language has that administrative chill. Not divine chaos. Not mythic improvisation. Structure. A governing order distributes authority according to capacity and need. Anu above. Enki below. Enlil in the living middle. It is almost beautiful in its logic. Almost. But beauty can be cold. If you were living in one of those cities, the sky would never be empty again after hearing such a worldview. A change in wind would have moral undertones. A dust storm might feel observational. A season of abundance could be read as monitored approval. A season of failure might seem like scrutiny hardening into judgment. There is a psychological power in that which goes beyond theology. A watched people begin to regulate themselves differently, even when the watcher is unseen. And that, I think, is where the older narrative starts becoming quietly profound. Enlil is not simply feared because he is powerful. He is feared because he is aware. Awareness is harder to escape than force. Force has an event. Awareness has duration. It lasts. It follows. It accumulates. The city of Nippur was the natural place for that feeling to root itself. Sacred precincts, archive rooms, upper platforms, rituals timed to celestial and atmospheric conditions, priests trained to interpret signs, rulers seeking approval before action. The temple was not just the place where people begged for help. It was the place where reports were read. However, symbolically or literally one chooses to understand that phrase. Human behavior rose upward through ritual channels. Divine judgment came back through weather and omen. I have always thought there is a little grim humor in the fact that the Lord of the Wind should also be the great evaluator of kings. A king may lock doors, silence advisors, flatter crowds, and still the wind goes through the city as if protocol means nothing to it. By the time we leave this first stretch of the story, one thing should feel clear. The old Sumerian world did not imagine Enlil as a god who had once touched Earth and moved on. It imagined him as the terrestrial authority most deeply entangled with human life, because the atmosphere itself was his field of operation. He watched through distance, through weather, through systems of priestly reception, through the very exposure of earthly existence. This is not yet the whole surveillance network. That comes next. But already the stage is set. The sky is no longer a backdrop. The temple is no longer merely a shrine. And human civilization, in these oldest records, is not alone for one moment beneath the air. Once Enlil is understood as Lord of the Middle Realm, the next question arrives almost on its own. How exactly does a god of wind and atmosphere watch a civilization spread across fields, canals, roads, palace courts, workshops, and distant towns? The texts answer that question in a way that is both grand and strangely practical. They answer it with infrastructure. The Ekur at Nippur was more than a place of worship. That sentence is easy to say and difficult to shake off. In many ancient cities, the great temple stood at the center because religion stood at the center. But in the Enlil material, the temple center feels operational. Inventories and ritual descriptions imply chambers reserved for receiving signs, preparing reports, training personnel, and maintaining the channels through which Enlil oversight functioned. Sacred space and observational space become almost indistinguishable. If you imagine the Ekur only as a monumental shell, the meaning slips away. It helps to picture it alive. Dawn coming pale across the Mesopotamian plain. Temple workers already moving through corridors with lamps. Clay tablets stacked in niches. Floors cool under bare feet. Outside, the city is still waking. Inside, a smaller and more deliberate day has already begun. Certain priests climb toward upper levels before the market opens. Others remain below with records of wind shifts, storm movements, irregular cloud forms, and strange changes in atmospheric pressure. Nothing is casual. Everything is noticed. This is where the old descriptions of seeing stones and wind listeners begin to matter. We do not know precisely what such devices were, and any honest telling should admit that. Some could have been ritual objects later interpreted too literally. Some may have been architectural features described in symbolic terms. Some may have involved polished surfaces, resonant chambers, or methods of sensory amplification that have no perfect modern equivalent in the record. But the important thing is not to force certainty. The important thing is the repeated assumption that communication could be received through atmosphere, and that temple personnel were trained to receive it. That training leaves a strong impression in the surviving record. Priests do not simply pray and then improvise meanings at random. The logs suggest correlation. A drought is noted in relation to governance. A storm is read against military behavior. Unusual winds are placed beside specific human actions. The sky becomes legible because the temple has developed a discipline of reading it. And behind that discipline stands the larger belief that Enlil is not silent. He comments through conditions. You know that feeling when a person says very little, but arranges the room so clearly that you know exactly how he feels. The Enlil system works a little like that. The weather is not merely expressive. It is administrative. It alters conditions on the ground, making approval or displeasure materially unavoidable. What deepens the unease is that the system does not seem to have stopped at broad signs alone. The tablets describe a network of lesser overseers, divine functionaries stationed in different locations and answering ultimately to Enlil authority. In some texts, these beings are called Anunnaki. In others, Igigi, and the terminology is not always tidy, but the pattern is unmistakable. Enlil does not watch alone. He governs through hierarchy. That is one of the most striking parts of the whole tradition. The old Mesopotamian divine order is not merely mythic pageantry with named gods playing symbolic roles. It behaves like a distributed intelligence structure. Different territories, different responsibilities, regular reporting, localized observation, centralized authority. The great lord of the middle realm watches through others as well as through the atmosphere itself. Tablets from places like Mari, Babylon, and other urban centers preserve hints of this broader arrangement. Local divine figures, templa intermediarias, regional oversight, all feeding into a greater order centered on Enlil's sovereignty. The suggestion is that specific areas were observed for specific categories of activity. Agriculture in one place, trade in another, construction, military movement, population growth, social instability. Each entered the field of observation through some designated chain. I have always found that more chilling than any single all-seeing God image. A single watcher is terrifying in a simple way. A system of watchers is terrifying in a durable way. It implies continuity. It implies specialization. It implies that knowledge is not only gathered, but processed. And that is exactly how the records begin to feel. Not simply supernatural awareness. Intelligence work. At Gersu and related sites, the descriptions of regular reporting become especially suggestive. Observations are not occasional. They follow rhythms, intervals, schedules. human activity is turned into information. Crop yields are noticed. Population counts are noticed. Building projects are noticed. Social unrest, unusual prosperity, dangerous ambition. All of it can move upward through the chain. The texts do not always give us the details modern readers crave, but the structure itself is there. Enlil rule depends on feedback. If you were standing on a road outside one of those cities, dust on your sandals, hearing carts in the distance and a flock of birds shifting suddenly across the light, you would not know exactly where the gaze was coming from. That may be part of the system's psychological genius. The watcher does not need to appear in bodily form each day. It is enough that the conditions of life suggest they are being read by something above and beyond the immediate human field. There is also a territorial intelligence to Enlil position that should not be missed. Anu is too high. Enki is too deep. Enlil is in the exact zone where weather becomes the perfect medium for surveillance and intervention. A storm can gather over one region and spare another. Wind patterns can shift trade, travel, and agriculture. Heat and drought can punish entire administrative failures without a sword ever being drawn. This makes Enlil not only a watcher, but a regulator. Temple logs reinforce this. Weather events are not random divine moods. They are responses. They are adjustments to the human landscape. A badly ruled district suffers. A favored city flourishes. A campaign delayed by foul atmospheric signs is not simply unlucky. It has entered the range of judgment. Kings, of course, understood this very well. That is why consultation with Enlil priests before major decisions appears so consistently. A ruler did not merely seek blessing. He sought readable alignment. He wanted to know whether the sky was hostile, permissive, or attentive in a way that could ruin him. There is an almost dark comedy in that. The king of a city can command soldiers, laborers, scribes, walls, and tax flows, yet still must ask temple specialists whether the air itself is against him. The more I sit with these records, the less I think of them as naive religion, and the more I think of them as an early total environment theory of power. Human authority is never absolute because the environment itself is under higher command, and because the environment surrounds everything. Divine oversight is total without always becoming visible. Nippur then becomes even more important. It is not simply the holy city of Enlil. It is the node through which atmospheric judgment is interpreted and translated into human policy. The temple is the hinge. What happens in the sky must be read somewhere. What is read must be preserved. What is preserved must shape action. So the archive grows. The priesthood grows. The procedures deepen. A civilization of canals and fields becomes, at the same time, a civilization of observed behavior. If you were inside the Akur on a night of rising storm, you might hear low voices in an upper chamber, the scrape of stylus on clay, the gusting air through aligned openings, a hanging lamp trembling just enough to make the shadows move. Somewhere below, a record is being made. Somewhere outside, a governor sleeps uneasily, or a farmer wonders whether the season is turning badly. The temple binds those two experiences together. It reads the sky on behalf of the city, but it also reads the city on behalf of the sky. That reciprocal movement is what gives the whole system its density. Surveillance is not passive. Reports move upward. Conditions move downward. Human behavior is seen. Atmospheric signals respond. Priests interpret and transmit. Rulers adjust. The loop closes. And still, we have not reached the most intimate part of the network yet. Because broad atmospheric observation can only go so far. Storms and winds can reveal patterns. Yes, temple towers can receive and interpret signs. Yes, but a society growing more complex, more urban, more inventive, would eventually require closer watchers. Closer than weather. Closer than omen. Closer even than a priest on a platform reading wind. That is why the story cannot stop at temples and storms. The next layer introduces beings stationed in the heavens and others moving among human beings directly, hidden in forms that allow them to enter cities, courts, roads, and conversations without immediate recognition. Once they enter, Enlil's gaze becomes no longer atmospheric only, but personnel. The sky keeps watching. The streets begin watching too. Temple maintenance records add another layer to the unease. The rituals required to keep communication open were not occasional decorations. They consumed labor, grain, oil, trained personnel, and time. That implies priority. A city can afford many sacred habits, but only the most important ones are maintained generation after generation with bureaucratic care. The operations connected to Enlil oversight were treated that way. Interruptions were dangerous. Neglect was dangerous. Silence from the channels was dangerous. A people who think the sky is watching will fear many things. A people who think the sky has stopped reporting will fear even more. This is also where the atmosphere of Nippur begins to feel almost like the atmosphere of a command room. Not noisy. Never that. Ancient power often worked in hush, but purposeful, measured. Priests stationed by height, by task, by timing. One reading horizon, one keeping records, one waiting for the correct wind, one relaying what has been judged to the ruler below. The old world can feel very far away until details like that appear. Then suddenly, it feels intimate enough to hear sandals turning on baked brick. And perhaps that is the most unnerving transition of all. Enlil is no longer only a name in a hymn. He becomes the organizing absence around which a city behaves. People plant, build, rule, pray, and negotiate under a belief that the atmosphere carries observation to a throne they cannot see. Once that belief hardens into procedure, it begins shaping society from within. Surveillance no longer needs spectacle. It only needs acceptance. Once a civilization accepts that the sky can judge it, another question begins to stir in the darker corners of thought. How close does that judgment come? Weather can watch from above. Yes. Storms can answer from a distance. Priests can read signs from high platforms and whisper them down into palace rooms. But cities grow complicated. Markets thicken. Roads multiply. Workshops invent. Rulers hide motives behind ceremonies. A king can smile in a public courtyard while planning something crooked in private. A farmer can obey in the temple and cheat in the field. Human life becomes too intricate for wind alone. That is where the next layer of the old Sumerian world begins to appear. And it is the layer that makes the whole thing feel less like religion and more like surveillance. Enlil does not watch only through atmosphere. He watches through beings stationed in the heavens and through others who move near human life itself. Once those figures enter the story, the old air around Nippur changes. The sky is still listening, but now the roads are listening too. The Igigi are among the first names that gather around this darker horizon. The traditions are not always tidy, and the terminology in Mesopotamian literature can shift between periods and languages. But the broad impression remains remarkably stable. These are heavenly watchers, workers, atondo, beings associated with the upper zones of divine administration. In some texts, they appear as laborers burdened by service before humanity is created. In others, they stand closer to celestial function and oversight. However the strands are untangled, one thing remains. They belong above, and yet their attention is bent downward. I have always found them strangely elegant in the imagination. Not because they are comforting. Quite the opposite. They suggest a distributed system of observation, one in which the Supreme Watcher does not rely only on personal sight or priestly interpretation. He has eyes placed in the heavens themselves. Not one eye, many. Imagine the night over ancient Mesopotamia, broad and dark and almost frighteningly clear. The stars do not look decorative there. They look arranged. Constellations rise in precise order. Certain lights return in faithful cycles. Others wander. Priests and astronomers learn the sky so well that change becomes meaningful. In a world like that, heavenly watchers do not feel absurd. They feel like the natural conclusion of pattern. If the heavens are ordered, perhaps they are also occupied. If occupied, perhaps they are tasked. The old narratives often speak of schedules, rotation, duties, and stations. Even when the language is wrapped in myth, the administrative taste of it remains. There is a sense that the world is monitored from fixed points. Specific stars, specific zones, specific lines of movement. Human beings below may see only lights. The divine order above sees lines of information. Crops succeeding, cities growing, armies forming, kings becoming too confident, priests becoming lazy, builders discovering too much. Nothing remains merely local once it enters the field of heavenly notice. If you were standing here with me, I might tell you this is where the story begins, feeling almost annoyingly modern. And I would mean that a little wryly. The ancient world did not have satellites, at least not in any sense we could prove, but it absolutely had the idea of layered observation from above. It had the idea that position creates knowledge. Height creates range. Distance does not weaken awareness. It refines it. The Igigi alone, however, do not complete the picture. A high watcher can track movement, scale, and pattern, but human beings do their most revealing work at close range. In whispers, in transaction, in lessons, in marriages, in inheritance disputes, in technical craft, in private bargains. The atmosphere may see the field and the palace roof, but it does not overhear every dangerous conversation in a back room. For that, the system needs proximity. This is where the Apkallu begin moving through the story like half-remembered shadows. Later Mesopotamian tradition remembers the Apkallu as sages, culture bearers, beings connected with wisdom, craft, sacred knowledge, and the transmission of civilizational order. Sometimes they are described in strange forms: fish cloaks, hybrid shapes, ritual images that seem to belong both to sea and court. Sometimes they appear almost like archetypes of the learned advisor, close to kings, close to temples, close to the mechanisms by which culture itself reproduces. They are not merely holy mascots. They are carriers of deep pattern. What makes them important here is not only what they teach, but where they stand. They move among humans. They advise. They observe. They preserve. In a darker reading, and the source we are following certainly leans into the darker reading, they function as terrestrial intelligence agents of divine rule. Not always recognized. Not always named plainly in the moment. Present in courts, schools, workshops, shrines, city foundations, and perhaps in the very design of institutions. Honestly, I have always found that more chilling than any monster. A monster announces itself. A sage does not. A terrifying being from the sky can be resisted because everyone sees it coming. A patient advisor in the corner of the room can shape a kingdom before anyone realizes what has happened. Think of a city gate at dusk. Traders entering. Donkeys pushing dust upward with each step. Guards bored and alert at once. A scribe checking marks on a clay token. A quiet, learned stranger entering with the kind of calm no ordinary merchant seems to possess. He asks the right questions. He notices the granaries. He notices the new wall. He notices which men are ambitious and which priests are divided. He listens in the market. He sits close to rulers later. He makes suggestions. He leaves behind knowledge that makes the city stronger, but also easier to read. That is the kind of atmosphere the Apkallu create in the imagination. Whether one treats them as literal beings, mythologized memory of elite knowledge bearers, or symbolic expressions of institutional intelligence, the function remains almost the same. They are the close-range eyes of a larger order. The old records also give us a phrase that deepens this whole structure. The ears of Enlil. It appears in different shades and settings, but the implication is hard to miss. Enlil does not only have signs and storms. He has listeners, trained recipients, people, or beings, or priestly offices designed to receive what ordinary life might miss. The temple, then, is not only a site of prayer, it becomes a receiver. The city is not only a settlement, it becomes an acoustic field. That may sound poetic until one notices how seriously ancient sacred architecture treated sound. Courtyards, resonant halls, elevated chambers, narrow passages. All of these shape what can be heard and how it can be interpreted. A whisper in one room is lost. A breath through a carved opening in another becomes a note. A chant in the right chamber vibrates stone. If Enlil is lord of the air, then sound itself becomes part of his territory. Listening becomes governance. There is something beautifully unsettling about that. The sky is not only watched, it is heard. The wind through specific openings can be read. The city below produces noise that rises upward. The heavens answer with weather. The temple stands in the middle, translating one kind of sound into another. Human civilization becomes, in effect, a monitored conversation between earth and atmosphere. You know that feeling when a room changes because one person silent in the corner has been hearing far more than anyone guessed. The ancient Mesopotamian world feels like that on a grand scale. Everyone is speaking, farming, trading, ruling, marrying, building, inventing. Somewhere above and within that activity, a layered order is listening. This is why the old flood traditions later make more sense than they first appear to. They are not simply stories of divine temper. They are stories of accumulated observation leading to intervention. A watcher system notices change long before judgment falls. Population density increases. Settlement patterns stabilize. Human authority grows more self-confident. Noise, in the old texts, becomes a problem. But perhaps noise does not mean mere sound. Perhaps it means organized human autonomy. Human beings becoming difficult to supervise because they have begun to generate their own durable systems. That thought may be getting ahead of us slightly, but it belongs here because the Watcher hierarchy is what makes such a judgment plausible inside the ancient framework. Enlil does not wake one morning, annoyed by ordinary life. He presides over a network that has been gathering information through weather, through heavenly watchers, through terrestrial sages, through trained listeners, through temples that function like interfaces between visible and invisible administration. I think that is why the whole story keeps pressing toward intelligence language, whether we like it or not. Reports. Station. Listeners. Intermediaries. Signs. Evaluation. Intervention. The vocabulary of surveillance is already there in embryonic form. We only hesitate to use it because the world is ancient, and ancient things are supposed to stay safely symbolic. But symbols often begin as structures, and structure is exactly what the next layer reveals. Because once heavenly watchers and terrestrial sages are in place, the physical architecture supporting them begins to matter even more. Height, orientation, acoustic design, hidden passages, observational lines. All of these start looking less ornamental and more functional. The ziggurat is no longer merely a holy mountain imitation. It becomes a tower built to participate in oversight. For now, though, let this third layer settle. Let the stars above Mesopotamia arrange themselves into a kind of patient grid. Let the Agigi stand at their stations. Let the Apkallu move through roads and courts in quiet disguise. Let the ears of Enlil lean toward wind and speech. Let the city breathe under a network that feels almost too complete to be comfortable. Because once the Watcher hierarchy is accepted, The temples themselves can never look innocent again. Their stairways, terraces, openings, chambers, and elevated shrines begin asking a new question. Not only whom did people worship there, but what exactly were those buildings designed to receive, transmit, and monitor all along? There is one more reason these watcher figures matter. They make loneliness inside the ancient city almost impossible. A person may close a door, lower his voice, and trust the night. Yet the system imagined by these texts allows no true unsupervised space. Heaven is posted. The temple is listening. Wisdom itself may be wearing human clothing and asking harmless questions in the square. Once that idea enters a civilization, obedience is no longer only ritual. It becomes atmospheric. A ziggurat looks solemn enough when viewed from a distance. Step upon step, rising from the flat earth like a thought too deliberate to be natural. Most people, seeing one in a museum reconstruction or an old drawing, understand it immediately as a temple tower, a sacred mountain made by hands, a place to bring the god nearer. All of that is true, or true enough. But once the watcher's system of Enlil is allowed into the room, the ziggurat begins changing shape. It stops being only symbolic and starts looking functional. That is where the story becomes especially eerie. Height matters in every surveillance system. Height widens the field. Height catches weather first. Height removes a watcher from street confusion while keeping the whole city open below. Ancient Mesopotamians knew this as well as any later military engineer. You do not build the largest sacred structure in the city on an elevated platform by accident. You build it because visibility and contact both improve there. At Nippur, at Babylon, at Ur, and in other sacred centers, the great stepped structures were tied to ritual. Yes, but also to line of sight, horizon measurement, celestial orientation, and atmospheric reading. Their upper shrines opened towards sky and wind. Their terraces gave graduated points of ascent, each level moving farther from common noise. Their mass stabilized authority in the landscape. A person standing on the summit did not simply stand closer to heaven in a poetic sense. He stood in the one place where the whole city, the surrounding fields, and the sky beyond could be read together. If you were climbing such a structure at dusk, the experience would teach you almost everything at once. Lower levels still carry the smell of city life, dung smoke, cooking grain, river dampness, oil, bodies, mud. Higher levels grow cleaner, colder, more exposed. The noise below thins into texture. Individual voices disappear. Wind becomes dominant. By the time you reach the upper shrine, you are no longer in ordinary urban space. You are in an observational threshold, neither fully among people nor fully beyond them. I have always thought that thresholds are where ancient architecture becomes most honest. It reveals what a culture thinks contact actually requires. In Mesopotamia, contact with the divine, or with the watching order behind the divine language, requires elevation, filtering, and alignment. The ziggurat is a machine for all three. Some of the old descriptions and later reconstructions suggest acoustic sophistication that goes beyond simple monumentality. chambers designed to resonate, narrow passages that concentrate moving air, carved surfaces that break or amplify sound, openings placed to catch particular winds. Again, caution is necessary. We should not pretend to have engineering blueprints for every lost sacred feature. But enough survives in architecture, text, and comparative study to show that sound mattered deeply. The buildings did not merely stand. They interacted with atmosphere. That detail becomes much darker once you remember the phrase, ears of Enlil. A temple can hear if it is designed to hear. Not in the magical fairy tale sense, though ancient people might have had no reason to separate the magical from the practical the way we do. In the simple material sense, vint entus. Stone carries vibration. Chambers hum. High terraces reveal changes in air pressure and direction before lower streets notice them. Priests trained within such spaces would not need to imagine that the building was participating in reception. They would feel it. Picture a narrow upper room lined with plastered brick, lit by one small flame, air moving through concealed or angled openings. A priest stands still long enough that he begins hearing differences most people would miss. A low moan in one direction means a particular wind shift. A dry hiss means another. The whole chamber becomes a listening device. Outside, the city sleeps or worries or plots. Inside, Enlil domain moves across stone. You know that feeling when you enter an old building and realize it behaves like an instrument. Every step sounds different. Every whisper changes with location. Ancient, sacred builders understood that instinctively. They worked in stone, brick, timber, bitumen, and plaster. But they also worked in resonance. It would have been almost foolish for a civilization obsessed with divine signals not to use architecture as part of signal interpretation. This is why some later records and traditions speak of sky mirrors, polished surfaces, hidden corridors, and upper chambers in language that can sound either mystical or technical, depending on the reader. Perhaps that ambiguity is the point. A communication structure for ancient priests would not separate the sacred from the functional. It would unite them. A polished stone used to catch certain celestial light might be a ritual object and an observational aid at once. A chamber designed to amplify specific atmospheric sounds might be holy precisely because it worked. The old source we are following leans hard into this possibility, and while some scholars would urge restraint, the general direction is not absurd. Mesopotamian sacred architecture was highly intentional. Alignments mattered. Access mattered. Verticality mattered. The temple complex was not random devotional clutter. It was ordered space built to mediate between human and divine domains. If the divine domain includes observation, then the architecture naturally becomes part of that observing system. And it did not stop with one tower. Across Mesopotamia, major sacred centers share enough structural logic that one begins to see standardization. Elevated platforms, restricted upper zones, broad lower courts for public ritual, controlled access points, storage and archive rooms, priest chambers, processional routes, observation lines toward horizon and celestial events. The city itself is organized around the sacred center, and the sacred center is organized around access to sky. Once you see that pattern, the phrase eyes and ears of Enlil no longer feels metaphorical only. It feels embedded. There is also the matter of hidden space. Many large ancient temple complexes include rooms, passage, and service areas not visible to the ordinary population. Some are practical, of course. Storage, maintenance, priestly preparation, ritual seclusion. But hidden space in a monitored society does more than store objects. It controls information. It determines who hears first, who sees first, who interprets first. A city may think it is receiving divine will in public ritual, but the conditions of that ritual are prepared elsewhere, in rooms most people never enter. Honestly, that is one reason old sacred power can feel so modern in its bones. It understands interface. Public experience on one side, restricted processing on the other. The ziggurat becomes the visible icon of something whose most decisive work may happen in chambers almost no one sees. Imagine the upper shrine door opening just before dawn. The priest steps out after a night of observation or ritual listening. Below him, the city is beginning its day. Bakers light ovens. Porters lift baskets. Palace servants move quietly. Somewhere a ruler waits for word. The priest descends carrying an interpretation of what the sky has said. Whether one reads that as true divine revelation, elite atmospheric science, or institutionalized control, the effect on the city is the same. Action below is shaped by knowledge claimed from above. That is a surveillance culture in sacred form. And as the source keeps insisting, Enlil's system likely extended far beyond Nippur itself. Other ziggurats and sacred towers across the region may have functioned as linked nodes, each receiving local conditions and feeding them into a broader pattern of oversight. That idea sounds extravagant until one remembers how administrative Mesopotamian civilization already was. Standardized measures, archived transactions, territorial management, bureaucratic continuity. Why should the sacred side of the culture be any less networked? If anything, it may have been more networked, because divine oversight required continuity across cities. A single center cannot monitor an expanding world alone. It needs repeaters, interpreters, localized channels, structures designed according to known principles so that communication and observation remain coherent from one region to another. That is where the ziggurat changes one final time in the imagination. It stops being just a tower and becomes a node of height, resonance, sightline, ritual authority, archive logic, and restricted transmission. A place where atmospheric information could be received, processed, and turned into governance. A place where the Watcher system touched the city most directly. The darker possibility, and the one our source ultimately wants us to feel, is that these structures were never only for worship. Worship may have been the public language that kept the system socially stable. The deeper function may have been observation, calibration, and control. People came believing they were honoring the god. Meanwhile, the building itself helped the god, or the institution speaking for the god. Keep them readable. I think that possibility lingers because it aligns so neatly with how ancient civilizations often worked. Public ritual and administrative control were not separate spheres. They were interwoven. The same procession that honored a deity also affirmed political order. The same temple that stored offerings stored records. The same priest who offered sacrifice interpreted weather for a king. Sacred architecture was already multifunctional. To imagine surveillance among those functions is not as wild as it first sounds. And once the temple towers are seen that way, another older narrative begins to darken at the edges. The flood. Because if Enlil truly maintained a watching system through atmosphere, priests, heavenly overseers, terrestrial intermediaries, and communication architecture, then a catastrophe as vast as the flood does not arrive as a sudden tantrum. It arrives as the final action of a monitored system reaching judgment. The towers had watched the cities grow. The skies had reported. The signs had accumulated. And one day the Supreme Watcher decided that observation alone was no longer enough. That is the threshold we are approaching now. The towers still stand in shadow. The wind still moves through their openings. Priests still listen. Cities still breathe below. But the entire apparatus of oversight has been gathering information for a long time, and the conclusions it is drawing about humanity are becoming harder, colder, and more final. And perhaps that is why later memory never lets these towers become harmless ruins in the imagination. Even broken, they still seem to be waiting for a signal. Even emptied, they look like instruments that once knew how to receive orders from a realm above ordinary kings. The stones keep that mood long after the priests are gone. By the time the flood enters the old Mesopotamian record, it no longer feels like a random disaster. That is the detail that gives the whole story its coldness. Random disaster is frightening in one way. It comes blind, strikes, and passes. The flood attached to Enlil feels different. It comes after attention, after watching, after long patience, after repeated signs. That changes everything. In the Atrahasis tradition, humanity becomes too loud. That line is famous, and also strangely misleading if taken in the most childish way. A great god does not lose sleep because villages are cheerful and children run in courtyards. Noise in these records feels larger than sound. It feels like density, expansion, friction, smoke from too many kilns, the grind of irrigation works, organized labor, growing cities, rulers acting with confidence, rituals multiplying, trade spreading, workshops improving, settlements becoming durable enough to generate power from within themselves. The earth is no longer thinly inhabited. It has become structured by human life. And for a watcher, that structure is dangerous. I have always found it revealing that the flood stories do not sound like the rage of a god who suddenly discovers human existence. Enlil has been close to humanity from the beginning. He knows what cities are. He knows what kingship does. He knows what temple culture requires. What seems to alarm him is not humanity simply existing, but humanity becoming self-organizing on a scale that strains supervision. The old phrase of noise may be a sacred way of saying that civilization itself has become difficult to manage. Think of a city from high above. At first, it is a cluster, then a system. Roads lead into it. Water channels feed it. Labor is stored in grain. Ritual calendars create rhythm. Workshops refine craft. Walls make territory visible. Records begin to outlast memory. A city at that point is not merely habitation. It is momentum. And momentum, once established, can move in directions its overseers do not fully like. That is why the old flood narratives feel administrative in their dread. The problem is not individual wickedness in the simple moral tale sense. The problem is scale. Human beings have begun producing society faster than oversight can comfortably absorb. The Watcher system has observed agriculture stabilizing life, canals distributing water more efficiently, storage creating resilience, rulers making decisions, and populations swelling around centers of power. The atmosphere still covers all of it. Yes, but the cities are no longer fragile. They are becoming self-confident. You know that feeling when a machine begins humming more loudly than its maker expected? Not because it is failing, but because it is finding its own strength. That is what humanity begins to feel like in these stories. A machine humming too well. Some strands of later tradition add another layer. And while these strands are contested and should be handled carefully, they fit the mood of the source we are following. Alongside ordinary human expansion, there are hints of mixed bloodlines, forbidden teachings, unauthorized transmissions of craft, and knowledge moving outside sanctioned channels. Whether one reads those as symbolic or literal, they all point in the same direction. Humanity is becoming less dependent, less transparent, less governable. Enlil, as supreme terrestrial watcher, does not merely notice that. He is responsible for it. That responsibility may be the darkest part of all. If he were a distant celestial tyrant, the flood could be dismissed as cruelty. But as Lord of the Middle Realm, he has been involved in the supervision of civilization from the start. He has watched the cities rise. He has allowed the systems to stabilize. He has maintained the channels of communication. Then, when the result becomes too autonomous, he decides on reduction. That has the chill of management, not madness. In Atrahasis, the divine assembly debates. The burden of humanity is weighed. The disturbing increase is measured. Enlil pushes toward destruction. Enki, as always, becomes the softer intelligence, the one more sympathetic to human continuation, the one who finds ways to preserve rather than erase. This contrast matters because it reveals that the flood decision is not simple mythic inevitability. It is policy. There are factions. There are disagreements. There is a strategic struggle over how much of the human project should remain. If you were standing on a ziggurat in that imagined age, long before the waters rose, perhaps nothing would yet look apocalyptic. Smoke would still lift from ovens. Reeds would still bend by canals. Children would still chase one another through courts. Scribes would still lean over damp clay. The danger would be invisible in the ordinary way history often hides it. It would exist in accumulation. One more city quarter. One more season of growth. One more ruler acting without sufficient fear. One more generation believing the structures of life belong to them rather than to the order above. Then the judgment begins. The old texts describe warning, vessel building, selective preservation, and a flood that does not feel local. It feels total because totality is what sacred memory requires. A local flood damages a district. This flood resets a world. Waters rise beyond all familiar boundaries. Fields vanish. Walls disappear. Temples drown. Cities become memory while still standing. The sound of such a catastrophe must have been unbearable if it happened in anything like the scale the story preserves. Yet the old literature does not linger on sensation for its own sake. It moves with terrible calm. Build. Seal. Preserve. Wait. The waters come. The world is cut in two. I think that restraint is what makes it powerful. The text behaves like a report filed after trauma. It does not need to scream because the scale is already understood. And what of Enlil in that moment? He is not absent. He is not surprised. The flood is not a natural mistake inside his realm. It is the final expression of his authority over atmosphere and earth. Wind drives it. Sky releases it. The middle realm, which has carried his supervision all along, becomes the instrument of reduction. The same domain that watched human civilization grow now washes much of it away. There is a moral darkness there that the source script rightly wants to preserve. The flood is not soft. It is not merely corrective in a tender sense. It is catastrophic by design. Yet even here the story refuses pure nihilism, because Enki subverts total destruction. A human line survives. Knowledge survives. Procedures survive. The possibility of restored cities survives. In other words, the divine system does not choose annihilation. It chooses contraction. That distinction matters. The world after the flood is smaller, frightened, more manageable, but not empty. The Watcher system has not destroyed its project. It has pruned it. And when the waters begin to settle in the imagination, one can feel the emotional temperature of the world change. The before world was noisy, expanding, risky. The after world is quiet in a wounded way. Mud everywhere. Broken boundaries. Fewer voices. Survivors carrying memory in fragments. The old networks of oversight now have a chance to be rebuilt with tighter control, clearer limits, and a renewed awareness of dependence. Humanity has learned again that it does not own the atmosphere that sustains it. This is why the flood stands exactly where it should in the larger Watcher narrative. It is the moment when observation becomes intervention. The skies do not only watch, they act. The towers do not only receive reports, they become monuments to what happens when reports turn into verdict. And yet, even after such a verdict, Enlil does not leave. That fact, which the next movement of the story will have to face fully, is already visible here. If his purpose had been only destruction, withdrawal would follow. But withdrawal does not follow. Reconstruction does. Kingship descends again. Cities rise again. Temple systems resume. Agricultural order is restored. That means the flood was not the end of oversight. It was the hard reset of oversight. The old world had grown too loud. The new world will begin under a quieter sky, but under the same sky, all the same. There is one more image I want to leave here before the waters fully recede. A city at the moment before disappearance. Not a famous city with a name carved in stone for tourists. Just an ordinary center of old human order. A threshold swept clean. A storage jar tipping in dark water. Reed mats lifting loose. A wall softening where flood presses against it. Someone looking back only once because there is no point in looking twice. The watcher has decided. The middle realm itself has turned against the confidence of those who lived beneath it. That image matters because it keeps the story human. Without it, the flood becomes abstraction. With it, the flood becomes what the ancient texts always imply it was. The breaking of continuity, the silencing of too successful a humanity. The terrible lesson that civilization itself can be treated as noise by the power that once supervised its growth. And so, the waters rise, not blindly, but under judgment. Not forever, but far enough. Not to erase the human line, but to make it kneel again. When they fall back, the sky will still belong to Enlil, and the earth, though emptied and raw, will still be his burden to watch. There is also the question of why the flood remains tied so firmly to city memory. If the concern were only biological excess, a watcher might reduce numbers without caring where those numbers lived. But the texts keep circling cities, foundations, kingship, urban order. That suggests the true target was not mere population. It was concentration. Human beings gathered together generate more than labor. They generate continuity, archives, alliance, innovation, and confidence. A city remembers itself. A city can begin to speak back to the sky. And perhaps that is the most dangerous form of noise. Not loudness, but persistence. A field can fail and be replanted. A wandering clan can move and vanish into distance. A city leaves a mark. Once walls, calendars, priesthoods, and storehouses begin reinforcing one another. Human life acquires inertia. The flood breaks that inertia. It interrupts the future before the future becomes too durable. So the catastrophe is not only water, it is deconcentration. It scatters accumulated certainty. It turns stored grain into rot, courts into mud, records into softened clay, public ritual into silence. Under such pressure, humanity is forced back into the smaller scale at which oversight can begin again from above. That is why the old stories of warning matter so much. A vessel is built. A line is preserved. Selected continuity is allowed. The flood destroys the swollen form, but not the possibility of form itself. It is almost surgical in its brutality. The patient survives. The dangerous growth does not. After the flood, the most surprising thing is not that humanity survives. The most surprising thing is that Enlil remains. A cruel ruler might destroy and withdraw. A weary ruler might hand the work to another. A distant ruler might decide the experiment had become too costly and abandon the earth to its own wounded recovery. But the old Mesopotamian materials, especially when read through the darker Watcher framework, do not allow that ending. Enlil stays. That detail changes the whole story. Because if the flood were only anger, departure would make sense. If the flood were only cosmic disgust, silence afterward would fit. Instead, the records imply reconstruction. Kingship descends again. Cities are founded again. Agricultural order is restored. Boundaries are redrawn. Temples reopen. The atmosphere does not stop being governed simply because humanity has been reduced. Oversight resumes because oversight was never temporary. I think that is one reason the post-flood world in Mesopotamian tradition feels so solemn. It is not simply the joy of survival. It is survival under renewed supervision. The survivors know something the before world forgot. The sky can end the argument. That knowledge becomes part of the emotional foundation of the new order. Imagine the first season after the waters begin to withdraw. Wet ground drying in the heat. The smell of silt and rot and fresh clay mixed together. Broken timbers lodged where streets once ran. Quiet where there should be crowding. A few people moving carefully, as if sound itself has become dangerous. Nothing in that landscape encourages pride. Everything encourages dependence. And in the middle of it, the old structures of authority begin returning. This is where Enlil's role becomes almost tragic in scale. He is not merely the one who judged. He is also the one whose domain must now be stabilized again. Weather must become survivable. Agricultural cycles must resume. Human kingship must be restored in manageable form. The temple systems must be re-established so communication between earth and sky does not break. The burden of control is still his. In some deep sense, the flood may even bind him more tightly to earth rather than freeing him from it. The source script places great weight on this point through the Tablet of Destinies. And while the traditions around that tablet vary, the symbolism is powerful enough that it belongs here. The Tablet of Destinies is not just an object of rule. It is cosmic authorization, the right and burden to establish how order will function. Whoever holds it does not merely command. He maintains the architecture of reality at the level of governance. If Enlil is bound to that role, then leaving Earth after the flood would not be a simple personal decision. It would be a structural abdication. And structure hates abdication. I have always found that thought unexpectedly melancholy, because it means Enlil may remain not only out of will to dominate, but out of impossible responsibility. He has built too much into the human world to withdraw safely. Too many channels depend on his atmospheric authority. Too much civilizational order has been organized under his domain. If he leaves, weather becomes politically vacant. The line between judgment and fertility becomes unstable. The systems below may not know how to continue coherently. This is one reason later Mesopotamian thought keeps circling around the idea of kingship descending again from heaven. The post-flood world is not self-assembling. It requires reinstallation. Authority is lowered back into human hands under controlled conditions. That is exactly what one would expect if Enlil remains the supervising terrestrial power, humanity is allowed to rebuild, but only inside a renewed framework of dependence. You know that feeling when a house has nearly burned and, after the flames are gone, the person responsible for rebuilding becomes more present than ever. Every beam is measured. Every wall is checked. Every small error suddenly matters. That is the post-flood mood of Enlil. The watcher who once tolerated expansion now oversees restoration with harder eyes. The texts reinforce that mood by preserving limits. Human lifespan contracts. Boundaries tighten. Authority structures become more explicit. Ritual order becomes more necessary, not less. The old pre-flood scale does not return. The world continues in a smaller register. Whether one reads that biologically, symbolically, or administratively, the logic is the same. Enlil is allowing continuity, but not a full return to the dangerous conditions that made the flood necessary. There is also a practical side to his remaining. The temple network itself cannot simply vanish. Nippur remains sacred. Enlil cult remains central. The Ekur still matters. Priests still read signs. Winds still carry judgment. All of that means the channels of oversight survived the catastrophe. The flood did not replace the watcher system. It purified it, thinned the field, and made its necessity obvious again. If you were walking through post-flood Nippur in the imagination, perhaps in an early dawn while reconstruction still felt raw, you would sense that change immediately. The city breathing again, but carefully. The temple rising again, but under a chastened sky. Priests moving with a little more seriousness than before, as though memory of what water can do now sits in every ritual gesture. Enlil is not absent from that city. He is almost heavier in it. This is also why other deities cannot simply take over his function. Anu is too remote. Enki is too associated with hidden depth, craft, and subterranean wisdom. He can preserve, advise, circumvent, even rescue, but he does not hold the same atmospheric sovereignty. Enlil alone governs the middle field where human life is exposed. Any attempt to transfer that role would risk breaking the old cosmic division. The very logic of the Mesopotamian divine order keeps him here. There is a darker interpretation as well, and it has to be admitted because the source leans toward it. Perhaps Enlil remains because control is addictive. Perhaps the flood proved not the limits of humanity, but the necessity of maintaining pressure on it. Perhaps the watcher cannot leave because the watched world has become the object around which his own authority now coheres. In that reading, Earth is not only his duty, it is his prison of power. He stays because he cannot imagine a self beyond management. I do not think the texts force a choice between those two moods, duty and domination. In fact, their power may come from carrying both. Enlil can be burdened and dangerous at once, responsible and controlling, necessary and terrifying. The atmosphere itself feels that way sometimes. It gives breath and storms. It ripens crops and tears roofs away. The lord of such a domain would naturally inherit the same ambiguity. By the time kingship descends again, the post-flood world is already living inside that ambiguity. Human rulers are restored, but on terms. Cities grow, but under memory of interruption. Temples rise, but as part of a surveillance order that has already proved it can become lethal. The new civilization is not naive. It begins with scar tissue. That scar tissue may be the greatest reason Enlil never leaves. A scar does not mean a wound is still open, but it does mean the body has reorganized itself around the memory of injury. Post-flood civilization reorganizes around the memory of divine monitoring and catastrophic correction. Enlil is built into that reorganization. To remove him would be to remove the logic by which the restored world understands itself. Honestly, I think that is why later traditions preserve him with such persistence even when other gods shift in prominence. Enlil may lose some public grandeur in later eras, but the structure of oversight, atmospheric judgment, mediated kingship, and temple-based reception never fully disappears. His pattern survives because the civilization shaped by flood could not forget the ruler who had authority over the medium that destroyed it. And there is one more reason he remains. The human project continues to interest the divine order. Flood did not end the experiment. It refined it. Enlil stays because the earth is still active, still unstable, still capable of swelling again toward dangerous autonomy. A watcher leaves only when the watched thing has become irrelevant. Humanity never becomes irrelevant in these records. It becomes reduced, reorganized, monitored, and taught fear, but not dismissed. The old world before the flood may have become too large, too loud, too independent. The new world after the flood begins under a lower ceiling of confidence. Yet as canals are dug again, fields planted again, kings crowned again, and cities rebuilt again, one can feel the old tension already preparing to return. Human beings do not stay quiet forever. Growth has a way of forgetting catastrophe once enough generations pass. That is why Enlil's continued presence matters so much. He remains not only because he judged the old world, but because he expects the same problem to rise again in the new one. He is the fixed pressure against human self-inflation. The sky, once it has drowned a civilization, is never innocent again. So let the post-flood mud dry slowly. Let the first boundary stones be set. Let smoke rise from new hearths in a thinner population. Let a temple stair be rebuilt one level at a time. Above it all, the air still moves, carrying the same lordship it carried before the waters came. Enlil has not gone anywhere. The flood did not conclude his reign over earth. It proved it. And as the rebuilt world settles into order once more, another thought begins to move behind the story. If he remained after such a catastrophe, then perhaps his watcher system did not shrink with the world. Perhaps it widened. Perhaps reconstruction demanded an even broader network, one stretching farther than Mesopotamia, one whose traces later ages would inherit in stone. Mountain shrines, underground chambers, and structures that seem built as much for observation as for worship. If you imagine the first post-flood coronation, the emotional atmosphere becomes even clearer. A ruler stands before priests who have seen enough ruin to distrust any human confidence not anchored above. The rites do not simply celebrate power, they restrain it. Kingship is received, not seized. The crown is less a prize than a tether. That is pure Enlil logic. Authority may function on earth, but it must remain exposed to the sky. And the people below would have learned the same lesson in ordinary life. A good harvest would never feel merely agricultural again. Rain would never feel merely seasonal. The moving air itself would carry memory. Every wind after the flood becomes a reminder that the same realm which gives breath can also remove the conditions of breathing on a civilizational scale. That kind of memory would keep a watcher present even when no apparition appears. Fear itself becomes part of the system of continuity. After the flood, the world does not become smaller in meaning. It becomes more carefully arranged. That is the strange turn the story takes once Enlil remains on Earth. A lesser ruler would have been satisfied with reduction. A frightened ruler might have narrowed his field, clung to one city, one people, one sacred center, and watched only what could be reached easily. But the logic of the watcher does something else. It expands through reconstruction. If human civilization is going to begin again, it must begin under stronger lines of observation than before. That is why the later sacred landscape starts feeling so uneasy when looked at through this older Mesopotamian frame. Structures appear across time and geography that seem to do more than honor heaven. They orient. They monitor. They align themselves to skies, horizon, solstices, stars, cardinal directions, subterranean chambers, hidden passages, and elevated terraces. It is possible, of course, to explain each monument in its own local terms, and often that is the responsible first step. But when too many of them begin resembling stations instead of shrines, the old suspicion returns. Worship may be the public language. Oversight may be the deeper function. Göbekli Tepe is one of the places where that suspicion grows very quietly and then becomes difficult to dismiss. The site is older than pottery, older than cities in the familiar sense, older than nearly every architecture of authority we are used to discussing. And yet, it does not feel primitive in the way old textbooks once expected. Massive T-shaped pillars, carvings of birds, serpents, foxes, boars, strange beings, carefully arranged enclosures, deliberate orientation, repetition, planning. The whole place carries an emotional atmosphere of encoded purpose. If you were standing there at dawn, before the tourists and interpretations, before the explanatory signs and the tidy museum prose, the feeling would be almost unnerving. The stone pillars would rise in silence around you. Their carved surfaces would catch the first light slowly. Shadows would stay cool near the base. Wind would move over the hill without asking anyone what century it belonged to. And the animals carved into the stone would not feel decorative. They would feel alert. I have always found the birds at Göbekli Tepe especially unsettling. Birds in ancient symbolism are never just birds for very long. They are watchers, messengers, carriers between levels of the world, eyes lifted above ordinary human height. In a story centered on Enlil as Lord of the Middle Realm, a site covered in avian and predatory imagery, positioned with celestial intentionality, begins to look less like a feast hall or communal sanctuary and more like a surveillance grammar in stone. Some scholars would object, and with reason. Göbekli Tepe belongs to its own cultural world. We should not flatten it into Mesopotamian mythology carelessly. True enough. Yet symbols migrate more easily than buildings. Functions migrate more easily than names. A watcher culture rebuilding after catastrophe might spread not identical temples, but related logics, elevated observation, ritualized sky alignment, stone forms that encode animals associated with vigilance, danger, and mediation. Even if Enlil's name had not yet emerged in the historical record, the pattern of overseen civilization may already have been older than the surviving vocabulary. And then, much later, there is Giza. The pyramids of Egypt are so famous that they almost suffer from overexposure. People stop seeing them because they have seen them too often in photographs. But if you return to them slowly, and if you let go for a moment of schoolbook explanations that turn them into gigantic tomb labels, their strangeness comes back very quickly. Their precision, their alignment, their hidden chambers, their shafts, their relationship to the cardinal directions, their silence in the desert. They do not look built simply to bury a body. They look calibrated. That word matters. Calibrated. If you were walking near the plateau at night, long after the heat had thinned and the air had taken on that dry mineral coolness only desert stone can hold, the pyramids would not feel dead. They would feel waiting. Beneath the visible mass lies a deeper darkness. Corridors, chambers, blocking stones, cavities discovered and still undiscovered. Above, the stars turn with an almost insulting steadiness. The whole complex seems less like a memorial than a device set into the earth. Now, I am not saying the Egyptians were priests of Enlil. That would be cheap and careless. But I am saying the source script is pointing towards something more interesting. The ancient world repeatedly builds structures that join three things together: height, restricted access, celestial orientation. That triad keeps returning, whether in Mesopotamian ziggurats, Egyptian pyramids, Anatolian stone circles, or later megalithic observatories. Once Enlil watcher system is in mind, that recurring triad starts looking like inherited design logic rather than isolated local genius. Height widens the field. Restricted access controls interpretation. Celestial orientation binds human space to monitored sky. Put those together, and you no longer have a monument alone. You have a node. I think that is why underground space becomes so important in these later sacred sites. A watcher system is never only about seeing. It is also about storing, filtering, restricting, and preserving. Underground chambers stabilize knowledge and protect equipment, texts, relics, or rites from casual contact. Hidden passages ensure that only the initiated can move between zones of operation. The public see grandeur. The inner circle maintains function. If that sounds like religion, yes, it is religion. If it sounds like administration, yes, it is that too. Ancient civilizations did not feel any need to separate the two. This logic appears again and again in later traditions. Persian magi studying stars and royal destiny. Hermetic schools preserving cosmic correspondences. Priestly and scholarly houses in the Hellenistic world treating astronomical knowledge as both sacred and political. Islamic scholars inheriting older star lore and translating it into disciplined mathematical observation. Monastic scriptoria copying older symbolic systems into safer theological language. The names change. The costumes improve or worsen depending on your taste. The underlying mood remains. Watch the heavens. Align the earth. Keep the channels intact. That continuity matters more than any one monument. Because the strongest version of the story is not that Enlil personally visited every later site in dramatic form. The strongest version is that the logic of his oversight survived and adapted. Structures, once meant to receive the sky, become observatories. Institutions once meant to interpret divine signs become schools of celestial and political intelligence. Secret traditions inherit the language of watchfulness without always preserving its original source name. The watcher remains present not only through direct rule, but through inherited architecture of attention. If you were sitting in a medieval monastery copying old manuscripts by candlelight, you might not think of yourself as participating in an ancient surveillance tradition. You might think you were preserving theology, astronomy, or moral teaching. Yet the very act of copying, of ensuring continuity of sky-centered knowledge through collapse and war and dynastic change, would place you in that same long river. The Watcher system does not need every guardian to understand the full origin of what he carries. It only needs fidelity. And fidelity is one of the strangest human powers. Empires collapse. Languages die. Stone cracks. Yet a pattern can move from temple to school, from school to mystery cult, from cult to archive, from archive to court, from court to monastery, from monastery to society, without ever fully losing its central instinct. Look up. Align below. Watch the growth of human order. Intervene when necessary. There is something almost darkly funny in how often civilization congratulates itself on invention when it may simply be inheriting old monitoring habits in nicer clothing. A priest with wind records becomes an astronomer with tables. An upper ziggurat platform becomes an observatory terrace. A hidden chamber in a temple becomes a restricted archive room in a palace or monastery. The tools change. The appetite for oversight does not. That is why some later, secretive traditions feel so charged in retrospect. Rosicrucian circles, Masonic symbolic systems, esoteric schools obsessed with geometry, orientation, ascent, hidden chambers, the eye above, the ladder between realms. All of these can be explained in their own historical development. Yet when placed inside the long afterlife of a Watcher civilization, they begin to look like fragments of a very old grammar refusing to die. Not proof, never proof, but pattern. Pattern is enough to keep a person awake. And by the time we reach the modern threshold, the pattern becomes almost embarrassing in its familiarity. A world oriented around observation towers, restricted rooms, elite interpreters, sky-aligned systems, hidden archives, Distributed networks. Human beings below, arranged into readable populations. If that is not the skeleton of surveillance culture, then the word has lost its meaning. Still, the older stone sites keep the story grounded. Göbekli Tepe, with its silent carved watchers. Giza, with its calibrated mass and hidden chambers. Mesopotamian ziggurats rising above cities like listening devices. Each one occupies the boundary where worship and observation overlap. Each one suggests that a civilization afraid of losing contact with the watching order would build in exactly this way. And each one leaves behind an emotional residue that later ages. No matter how rational they pretend to be, still respond to with awe. That awe matters because awe is often the public face of controlled access. People stand outside and feel the structure is greater than they are. They accept that they do not fully understand it. They defer to those allowed farther in. A watcher system depends on that psychology. The sky is higher. The tower is higher. The priests know more. The rulers consult them. The people wait below and try not to anger what cannot be fully seen. By now, the world of Enlil feels less like one ancient religion and more like a template that later civilizations kept translating into their own architectural and intellectual dialects. That does not make every stone circle his. It does not make every pyramid a Mesopotamian derivative. It means something subtler. The ancient conviction that ordered civilization must remain under a higher gaze may have become one of the deepest design instincts of the human world. And once that possibility is felt, only one step remains. We have to ask whether the old watcher system truly ended at all, or whether it simply entered a new medium. Because if the atmospheric gaze of Enlil survived in logic, architecture, and institution, then the modern age may not have escaped it. It may have mechanized it. The tower becomes the control room. The star grid becomes the satellite array. The ears of Enlil become microphones, sensors, data centers, predictive systems. The watcher does not disappear. He learns to love electricity. The final turn in this story is the one that makes the room feel cold again. Ancient watchfulness is unsettling, yes, but distance can soften it. Clay belongs to museums. Ziggurats belong to ruins. Pyramid shafts and buried chambers belong to documentaries and scholarly disputes. A person can listen to all of that and still keep a safe little border around the present. That border becomes harder to keep once the watcher system enters modern form. Because what is a surveillance culture if not a civilization that believes height, distance, restricted interpretation, and continuous data gathering produce legitimate control? And what is the modern world if not the most complete realization of those conditions humanity has ever built for itself? Look at a contemporary control room. Banks of screens, streams of weather data, traffic data, military data, behavioral data, population data, remote eyes, aerial eyes, orbital eyes, software that notices patterns faster than the human mind can follow them, analysts trained to interpret signs flowing downward from distances no citizen can touch. It is almost impossible not to hear the old structure inside the new one. The language has changed. The appetite has not. I have always found that grimly amusing in the way history sometimes is. Humanity may have spent thousands of years trying to escape the fear of divine observation, only to construct an earthly version so complete that the old gods, if they ever existed, could relax and let the machines handle the boring parts. The source script pushes hardest here, comparing Enlil ancient oversight with modern radar anomalies, unidentified aerial phenomena, satellite, state monitoring systems, AI prediction, and the thin shiver most people now feel when they realize how little of their daily movement is truly unrecorded. We should be careful. Of course, a clay tablet is not a satellite. A ziggurat is not a server farm. Correlation is not identity. But some patterns are too sharp to ignore. Height still matters. Distance still matters. Data still flows upward to restricted interpreters. Decisions still come downward from hidden rooms. The ordinary person still lives below systems too vast to see in full. And the sky remains the preferred zone of authority. Aircraft, drones, satellites, weather systems, orbital platforms, high atmosphere sensors. Even now, the realm above us is where power becomes hardest to question. That would have made perfect sense to Enlil. If you were standing alone outside a modern city late at night, watching the red lights of aircraft blink slowly in distant darkness, or seeing a satellite move with mechanical serenity across the stars, the old Mesopotamian feeling might return whether you wanted it to or not. Someone above. Regular paths. Invisible purpose. Information gathered without permission from those below. The emotional grammar has barely changed. Only the interfaces have improved. This is where the old stories of strange aerial presence become relevant. Not because every unexplained light proves divine continuity, but because human beings consistently attach unease to watched skies. In the ancient world, the heavens were populated by watcher beings, divine attendants, signaling atmospheres, and ruling winds. In the modern world, official language becomes more technical, more embarrassed, more bureaucratic. Yet the feeling persists. Objects seen, tracked, denied, reclassified. The sky as the realm of incomplete explanation. The public told little. Specialists told more. Hidden chambers of interpretation somewhere else. You know that feeling when you suspect that the explanation exists, but not for you. That is the modern version of temple access. The upper shrine still exists. It just has clearance protocols now. AI makes the old comparison even darker. An ancient watcher culture dreams of total awareness through layered observation and trained interpreters. Artificial intelligence, at least in its current administrative use, pursues the same dream with industrial patience. It does not merely store information. It notices patterns. It predicts. It flags anomalies. It builds profiles. It decides what kind of human movement is ordinary and what kind deserves intervention. Weather once served Enlil in the myths as a responsive medium of judgment. Data now serves institutions in eerily similar form. Not because the machine is a god. That is too simple and, frankly, too melodramatic. The machine matters because it allows human systems to imitate divine oversight more convincingly than ever before. This is where the story becomes less about whether Enlil literally lives above the clouds, and more about whether his ancient role has become embedded in the logic of civilization itself. Supreme Watcher, Atmospheric Domain, Distributed Eyes, Hidden Interpreters, Intervention when growth becomes dangerous. It is all still here. The names alone have changed. That is why the final question refuses to be settled neatly. Was Enlil ever a benevolent guardian at all? Was he preserving the balance of a fragile world against destructive human excess? Or was he the first great manager, the prototype of every power that claims order requires permanent observation from above? The old texts never answer in a way that lets a listener sleep comfortably. He feeds the world through regulated weather. He also drowns it. He stabilizes kingship. He also limits it. He remains because the world still needs governing. He remains because he cannot bear to lose control. Both readings breathe inside the same figure. And perhaps that is why he endures. A simple villain does not last across millennia. A simple savior does not either. What lasts are the powers that feel like conditions of existence. Enlil, in the old stories, is exactly that kind of figure. He is the governing atmosphere, the pressure above the skin of civilization, the intelligence in the weather, the reminder that growth will always be measured by something outside itself. If you take the strictest scholarly view, all of this remains symbolic, an ancient theological system reflecting the anxieties of early urban life. Fair enough. If you take the darker mythic view, then the symbolism itself may be the surviving shell of a reality older and stranger than modern comfort allows. Either way, the emotional force is the same. Humanity has never escaped the feeling of being observed, judged, and managed from above. We have only changed the vocabulary we use when speaking of it. That is why the modern control room and the ancient temple tower feel like distant relatives. One glows with monitors, one with oil lamps. One tracks patterns in data streams. One tracks them in stars, winds, and omens. Both require specialists. Both stand above ordinary life. Both claim to translate a higher field of information into decisions that shape the lives of others. The old divine watcher may be gone. The role remains uncannily intact. And yet the older mysteries do not fully fade even then. The unidentified object over a desert installation. The radar track that behaves too intelligently. The recurring testimony that the atmosphere still hosts things not fully accounted for. The sense, stubborn and difficult to eliminate, that human surveillance may itself be only one layer beneath a still larger gaze. The ancient world would not have found that idea surprising at all. It would have called it normal. If you were standing beside me now, at the edge of this final stretch, I think we would both go quiet for a moment. Because the story began with clay tablets and winds over Nippur, and it ends with something much closer. Not ancient ruin, but present feeling. The feeling of living in a civilization that can barely tell where divine oversight ends, where institutional oversight begins, and where self-surveillance finishes the work. People carry tracking devices willingly. Cities watch their citizens. States study populations. Algorithms predict behavior. Cameras bloom on every corner like iron flowers. We have built a world in which almost no one needs to say the sky is watching, because the built environment says it for us. That would be a very Enlil outcome. Not peace. Not freedom. Not simple slavery either. A managed world. A world permitted to continue so long as it remains legible. A world where intervention always waits in reserve if growth becomes too loud, too independent, too difficult to supervise. And so, the last image returns us upward, not all the way to heaven, only to the middle realm, the old Mesopotamian zone between gods beyond reach and waters hidden below. Air, cloud, stormlight, aircraft trail, satellite movement, invisible signals crossing the dark. The same region that once belonged to Enlil still belongs to power. That fact alone is enough to make the old story feel less dead than it should. Perhaps he never left, because Earth itself became his office. Perhaps he never left, because the Watcher is not one being, but one ancient role that each age fills with its own tools. Perhaps he never left, because humanity keeps rebuilding his throne in every system that values order above intimacy. I do not think the story lets us choose too easily. What it does let us feel is older and stranger. The oldest cities rose under a sky they believed was paying attention. The modern city glows under a sky full of instruments that really are paying attention. Between those two conditions lies all of recorded history, and the line between them is thinner than most people would like. So let the room go quiet now. Let the fire fall to a lower red. Let the old tablets rest again in their drawers. Let the towers of Nippur and Babylon sink back into darkness. Let Göbekli Tepe stand under stars. Let Giza wait in desert cold. Let the control rooms of the present hum softly in their hidden buildings. And let the ancient Lord of the Air, whether God, symbol, or prototype, remain where the story first placed him, above human ambition, within the realm of breath and pressure and signal, listening for the moment when noise becomes danger. The last comfort, if it is a comfort, is that watch civilizations also learn to watch themselves. Awareness does not only produce obedience. Sometimes it produces awakening. The person who understands the system begins noticing its outlines. He sees the tower in the control room, the priest in the analyst, the omen log in the data stream, the eye of Enlil in the camera lens. Recognition may not free him entirely, but it changes the quality of his sleep. He is no longer innocent under the sky. Perhaps that is the final inheritance of the Supreme Watcher. Not fear alone, but a terrible literacy. And with that, the story has reached the point where it can only leave you beneath the same ceiling that covered the first cities, though ours now is cluttered with metal, code, and artificial light. Somewhere above, the old middle realm still belongs to whoever can observe most completely. The Sumerians gave that dominion a name. We have given it newer ones. The gaze remains. Good night.